Thank you. Welcome back, and welcome back to what I would call the rocket and missile session. We have a stellar list of contributors. Actually, I would say we couldn't have a better team than this. Professor Andrew Erickson, U.S. Naval War College, will talk about China's conventional military power. And then Dr. Michael Chase of Rand Corporation will talk about China's nuclear capabilities. And Professor Kevin Polpita of UC San Diego will talk about three different domains: outer space, cyberspace, and the Arctic. And then we have two... Andrew. I just introduced him. And then we have two discussants, Professor Linda Jacobsen, now at University of Sydney, and then Professor Yoji at University of New South Wales, but currently visiting East Asia Institute in Singapore. And each speaker will speak for 15 minutes, followed by discussions. Each discussion will use 20 minutes because each discussion will discuss all three papers. Okay, so in that order. Andrew?
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chung, for that kind introduction, and thank you also to Dr. Ham and to the Asan Institute, as well as Seoul National University. With a combination of hosts and colleagues like this, I knew long ago that it was going to be a fantastic event, and I have not been disappointed. I'm humbled on this panel to have with me some of the top American experts on the PLA, as well as two discussants whom I know will give me great ideas for significantly strengthening and improving my paper. So I very much look forward to learning here. And I'm encouraged by the discussion we've had so far. I think it's been very respectful but very substantive, no compulsion to automatically agree. I think some of the greatest research insights come when we disagree constructively and come to new synthesis in terms of ideas. Before I go further, let me make the obligatory disclaimer that everything I say here and in my paper represents solely my personal views, particularly in my personal capacity as an associate in research at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard. It, of course, in no way represents the policies or estimates of the U.S. Navy or any other organization of the U.S. government, in case that wasn't already clear. I was very interested and excited when Professor Chung gave me the assignment of looking at China's conventional military modernization, particularly focusing on China's naval and air forces. I say air forces because, of course, while the PLA Air Force has the majority of Chinese military aircraft, the PLA Navy aviation also has a very significant and growing portion. And through the aircraft carrier Liaoning, as well as increasing numbers of helicopter capable surface vessels, is taking more and more air power to sea, albeit from a very low baseline. So it's interesting to think how those different Chinese air forces are developing and how they may be interacting over time. I think a lot of additional research is still needed to determine where that is going to go. I also was particularly happy to see Dr. Chung's instruction to look out to 2025. I think there have been far too few studies attempting to look at least a decade beyond the present time in terms of where China's military is likely to be headed. Now, of course, absolute predictions are likely to be incorrect. There are so many variables in this equation, it's very hard to know what the future is going to be, but that whatever that future ends up being, the impact for the region, for Korea, for the United States, for China itself, will be so significant that it's really incumbent upon us to try to start looking at what some of the key drivers and trends might be and what they might look out to. I've taken the liberty in my paper of also looking out toward to roughly the 2030 time horizon, because this takes us a little bit further beyond China's current military procurement pipeline, and it also allowed me to look at some of the larger trends, economic and otherwise, that we've discussed already a bit earlier today, that are going to have a significant impact here. I've been interested to read periodically every 4 years the U.S. National Intelligence Council's Global Trends reports, with 2030 being the latest one. And I think it is quite interesting that this latest report suggests that by 2022, China's economy will be equal in size to that of the U.S. as measured through purchasing power parity, and sometime before 2030 in absolute terms. It's certainly a possibility that we need to consider. I start off in my paper by attempting to assess concisely where China's naval and air force development stands today. And as many of you know, if you've followed my other work, I really see this as a case of a lot of capabilities being focused on what Chinese strategists call the near seas, Jinhai, the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea. This is the location of all of China's outstanding island and maritime claims. China has already largely met its security goals in the inner layers geographically of its security interests, so the near seas is the next logical layer of focus for China's military development. Now, unquestionably, there is Chinese naval and even a small amount of Chinese Air Force power projection beyond this immediate region. The Navy is really leading the way with its Gulf of Aden anti-piracy deployments, 16 task forces escorting over 5,000 Chinese and foreign ships since departing China first, December 26, 2008. And even the Air Force has had a modest role in helping to evacuate Chinese citizens from Libya in February and March 2011. But I argue that these types of out-of-area, long-distance power projection operations are really the exception rather than the rule. And while they do serve a useful presence and shaping a function for China in extending its influence overseas, these in no way can be conflated with really robust power projection capabilities, high-intensity combat capabilities. The most potent capabilities, as importantly supported in part by the 2nd Artillery Force capabilities that Dr. Chase will be talking about in his presentation, the real important combat capabilities are focused on the near seas, the airspace above them, and their immediate approaches. And this is part of an effort by China not to seek war per se, of course, but rather to increase its influence, to encourage China's neighbors with whom it has disputes to cooperate on terms that China promotes, and to discourage the active involvement of what China perceives to be an outside power, such as the United States, from intervening in a significant area of tension, crisis, or in a worst-case scenario, conflict. The U.S., of course, has very important alliances and treaty obligations in the region, and so is not willing not to be involved. And because China realizes this creates an additional impetus for China to develop capabilities that not only are relevant directly to any potential operational scenarios in the near seas, but also can develop to what some Chinese writings call counterintervention, and what U.S. military writings refer to as anti-access area denial, to really with the goal in peacetime of altering U.S. policy, affecting U.S. regional alliances to discourage that kind of involvement and influence. The good news is that beyond the near seas, I think there's a tremendous potential, which we're already seeing realized, for cooperation between the U.S. and China, joint exercises in the Gulf of Aden. Unfortunately, because of the issues I just mentioned, with respect to the near seas per se, this development and tension continues. And I think that's really the core of the challenge, and hence the continued focus of China's naval and air force development. But as we challenge ourselves to look out to 2025 and 2030, it's important to ask how things might be different. And there are indeed a number of factors that could affect Chinese military development to bring more emphasis, at least a sort of secondary layer of Chinese power projection capabilities out into the Indian Ocean to better secure those very important sea lanes, seaborne commerce, and energy shipments. As we've already seen in China's most recent defense white paper, having more capacity to protect Chinese citizens overseas and their property. These are definitely drivers that potentially apply to China's military development, and I've attempted to examine those in the paper, and I think at least at the margin this will shape China's military development over the next 10 or 15 years. However, I do want to stress, I think there will be limits to how much in that time frame this can alter the nature and course of China's military development. The very sorts of asymmetric approaches of disproportional effectiveness that China has benefited from in developing its naval and air forces vis-a-vis the near seas do not translate well to the so-called far seas or more distant operations. These types of operations are much more difficult, much more expensive, rely much more on overseas facilities access and infrastructure that is politically complex for China to develop actively. These types of forces tend to be much more vulnerable. There are far fewer workarounds to make them effective and to protect them. Very different for near seas operations for China. So I think by 2025, 2030, we will see some significant changes, but I don't think the rapidity or ease with which China could make changes in that direction should be exaggerated. Some of the Western writings that loosely use historical analogies and say something along the lines of China's a great powers have great navies, China will inherently want a blue water navy and will automatically pursue this. It is not that simple. China has already arrived as a great power with tremendous strength and influence in its immediate region, but the most interesting question, and it is still very much a question, is to what degree China will actively seek and succeed in building on top of that a layer of real power projection capabilities much further beyond. So I look forward to learning very much from the group here and to exploring these questions in greater depth and substance in my paper for Dr. Chong's edited volume. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Asan Policy Institute and Seoul National University for inviting me to this conference and to be one of the authors of a chapter for, I think, what promises to be a really fascinating edited volume. I'd like to also make a brief disclaimer, similar to the one that Andrew had to offer prior to his presentation. Mine is just a little bit different. It's, again, the case that my views are my own personal views. But in the case of the RAND Corporation, they represent neither the RAND Corporation nor any of its research sponsors. With that out of the way, I'd like to say one thing I was excited about when I was invited to write this paper is that I think Dr. Chung did something very useful here, which was to ask me to look not only at where China's nuclear forces are today and where they're going in the future, but also to take a look retrospectively at where they have been and where China is coming from, because many of the assessments I think that are out there right now, I think provide kind of a snapshot of where China is right now, or some projections about where they might go in the future. But understanding where they've come from, I think, is also a very important part of this, because the history of China's nuclear force structure has been so much different than that of the other major nuclear powers. So I think that we are, across the chapters in this volume, kind of looking back at a span of about 30 years, as well as where we are now and looking into the future, I think is extraordinarily useful. I deviated very slightly from the assignment in the sense that I went back a little bit more than 30 years, but I hope that readers of the paper will find that informative. So the first thing I'd like to do is provide just a very brief kind of introductory overview of the paper that kind of will highlight my key conclusions, and then I'll go into a more detailed discussion of several issues. So first of all, from a policy perspective, China still adheres to a no first use nuclear policy. Certainly there are circumstances under which Chinese military strategists believe that nuclear weapons could help to deter certain types of strategic conventional attacks, and one could see that as potentially inconsistent with the no first use policy, but that tension is there as well. So I wanted to start out with that brief point about policy and strategy. And then in terms of the modernization of China's nuclear force, really here the key development is that after relying on a very small and very outdated nuclear force for several decades, China is now making the transition to a larger, more sophisticated, more survivable, and therefore more credible nuclear deterrent. And so that, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a few minutes. But this is largely about mobility, because mobile forces are more survivable. The Chinese are also doing a number of things to try to counter missile defense developments. Again, something that they see as really critical to the credibility of their nuclear deterrent. They're also improving their nuclear command and control, which is quite important as well. Now, again, by way of kind of summarizing my key findings, these efforts have been underway for years, and in some cases for decades. And so it's important to understand that although one could characterize the process as kind of accelerating recently, it's one that has deep historical roots. And again, these are programs that in some cases have been underway since the mid to late 1980s. So I would suggest that the important development here is not really a change in policy. It's not really a change in China's overall approach to nuclear weapons. It's a change in the force structure that supports the policy. And that force structure, again, is becoming larger. It's becoming more modern. It now includes platforms like ballistic missile submarines, road mobile intercontinental ballistic missiles. And this is really providing China with what they describe as a lean and effective nuclear deterrent. That's the terminology that they use in their defense white papers. The one that China believes is required to meet its national security needs. Now, when we look forward to the future, I think that this does give them some policy and strategy options that they have previously lacked. And I'm very hesitant to make predictions about the policy and strategy decisions that Chinese leaders in 2025 or 2030 might make, but I will make a few predictions about the force structure that they will have at their disposal when they think about those issues. So first let me talk a little bit about the historical force structure, because again, it's very important to understand where China came from. And the first nuclear test, of course, was conducted in 1964. The Second Artillery Force, China's strategic missile force, was established in 1966. As Andrew pointed out, Second Artillery Force is currently responsible both for nuclear deterrence and conventional precision strikes. However, that conventional mission was added in the 1990s. So the kind of history that we're talking about now predates the Second Artillery's conventional mission. So in the late 1960s, after having a nuclear weapons capability for several years, China finally began to deploy forces that would allow it to deliver nuclear weapons against potential adversaries. But the forces it deployed initially were extremely problematic and had very, very limited capabilities. So the first ballistic missile that was deployed in China was the DF-2, which was really very kind of backward technologically, very poor response time, and a very, very limited capability. This is the one that's probably most famous for the 1966 nuclear test where China launched a live nuclear warhead on a ballistic missile to its western impact range. That was on the DF-2, and that was China's fourth nuclear test. So that system was deployed or was considered at least operationally capable in the late 1960s. It wasn't until the early 1970s that China started to add longer range nuclear missiles to its inventory. The first of those, the DF-3 intermediate range ballistic missile, began entering service in 1971. So we're now talking about 7 years after the first nuclear test that China conducted. So that's how much time elapsed before China deployed its first intermediate range ballistic missile. The longer range systems that sort of became progressively longer range and more modern were under testing at that point, but they didn't begin entering service until later in the 1970s. So the next one was the DF-4. That was the first weapon, the first nuclear capability China had that could reach Moscow. And of course, keep in mind that in the 1970s, really the principal threat to China's national security was coming, of course, not from the United States, but from the Soviet Union. And that system wasn't deployed until, depending on whose estimate you consider the most authoritative, sometime between 1975 and about 1980. And so there was, again, a period of a number of years when China was extraordinarily vulnerable to the Soviet Union, had been subject to nuclear threats or nuclear coercion, as the Chinese would put it, at the hands of the Soviet Union, and still hadn't yet deployed a nuclear system that really had a strong capability to deter a Soviet attack against China. In the early 1980s, China finally began deploying its first true ICBM, the DF-5. That was the first ICBM China deployed that could reach the United States. But again, very slow progress throughout this period, and it was only in 1981 that China deployed its first 2 DF-5 ICBMs. So again, think about this period of time in the Cold War. One of the other things that Professor Chung asked us to do was to compare Chinese capabilities to US capabilities. In this case, I think it's also relevant to compare them to Soviet and now Russian capabilities. And again, we're talking about, for China in the early 1980s, 2 ICBMs, okay, compared to the nuclear superpowers having tens of thousands of nuclear weapons in their arsenals at that point in time. China also had underway its first ballistic missile submarine development program, which was not very successful, but was still underway at this time, and resulted in the first flight test, first successful flight test of a submarine-launched ballistic missile in 1982. But that program overall really never yielded the capability that China wanted. So this historic force structure was quite small, quite unsophisticated, and potentially quite vulnerable when you put it in light of a comparison with what the United States could bring to bear and what the Soviet Union had in its arsenal at that time. So again, one of the puzzles that scholars of Chinese nuclear issues and strategic deterrence have looked at is why they made such a slow progress throughout this period of the 1960s, 70s, and 1980s. In the 1980s, they started to become more concerned about threats to the credibility of their deterrent, and started to develop their road mobile missile programs, again, to try to increase their survivability. The Chinese also became more concerned about developments in missile defense, and therefore started thinking much more seriously about how they would penetrate or overwhelm an adversary's missile defense system. But again, although they made some important decisions in this respect in the 1980s, it was about 20 years really before these programs resulted in operational capabilities that were deployed to Second Artillery Force units. So again, progress was relatively slow, really remarkably slow compared to the other nuclear powers throughout this period. That kind of brings us to China's contemporary nuclear force structure. which, although still quite modest compared to what the United States has or compared to what Russia has, is already much larger and much more sophisticated than what China had at its disposal historically. So today, China has still approximately 20 silo-based ICBMs. And again, these are the ones that began entering service in 1981. But it also has about 20 to 40 road mobile ICBMs that started entering service in 2006 and 2007. And so that is already giving China a more survivable nuclear force. And again, from an international relations or security studies kind of theoretical perspective, really the critical thing here for a nuclear power of China's size in particular is to have a force that can survive an adversary's first strike, because that's what makes it a credible nuclear deterrent. Also, more recently, China has finally begun to take its nuclear deterrent to sea. This is an ambition that China had since the 1970s, but one that is only now first really being realized with the entry into service of several Type 094 ballistic missile submarines with the PLA Navy. The US Navy has publicly offered the judgment that China will conduct its first deterrent patrol with those Jin-class ballistic missile submarines sometime this year. And so that will mark a really important qualitative change in the nature of nuclear deterrence for China, because for the first time, they'll have a dyad composed of land-based missiles and sea-based ballistic missiles. Of course, in the United States, we talk about our nuclear triad. This is still going to be a dyad for China, given that the PLA Air Force appears to lack a nuclear deterrent role at this point in time. But again, this is a big change in China's nuclear force structure. So if we think about where this might go in the future, this is really a very important question. Because some people in the United States and Russia in particular have speculated that China might aspire to have a much larger nuclear force than the one it has now. I don't believe that there's really any evidence to support that assertion, with the idea there being that China might wish to have as many nuclear weapons as the United States or Russia. I don't believe that that's true. I also don't think that that's really within the realm of China's current capabilities. However, they may have a nuclear force that is substantially larger than the one that they have today. In fact, I think it's quite likely that it will at least kind of double in size in terms of their intercontinental systems over the period of time that Professor Chung asked us to look at. There will also be more advanced and more capable systems as part of that force. There will probably be greater diversity even than there is now, in the sense that I think China will deploy eventually a road mobile intercontinental ballistic missile that's capable of carrying multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles. I think that they will eventually, although not necessarily in the time frame that we're discussing here, but I think they will at least move closer to having a more advanced sea-based nuclear deterrent. What would be for China their third generation ballistic missile submarine at least will be under development during this period of time. The PLA Air Force may or may not end up having a nuclear role. Some Chinese military Air Force officers who write about the future of China's Air Force talk about having strategic bombers with a nuclear strike capability in addition to a conventional capability. Whether that's something that the PLA Air Force will do or not, I don't know, but it's something that we can look out for, whether China will choose to develop a nuclear triad, which would then look sort of like what the United States has, but on a much smaller scale. There are also other more advanced programs, such as a hypersonic glide vehicle test. China conducted a test of that system earlier this year and publicly confirmed that they had done so. That's a capability they could use to try to ensure that they'll be able to contend with enemy missile defense systems. It's also a capability that they could use to develop a conventional prompt global strike capability like the one that's often discussed in the United States. Of course, what they ultimately choose to do with hypersonic glide vehicles remains to be seen, and whether they will enter into service in the period that we're considering here, of course, it's I don't think is really possible to predict with any great certainty at this point in time, but that's certainly another development to keep a close eye on. So in terms of my conclusion, overall implications here, China has come a long way already. If you look back over the past 30 or especially 40 years and compare that to where they are today, they've already, I think, developed a much more modern and more capable nuclear force than what they had historically. Where that will go in the future remains to be seen. I think it's a relatively safe bet that they'll continue to increase the size and sophistication of their nuclear force. but will not reach a level of parity with the United States or Russia. I used to say, unless there are deep cuts in the US and Russian arsenals, I no longer think that that's a likely outcome given the current state of the US-Russia relationship and discussions about arms control. So I think there's very little chance that China will become a peer of the US and Russia. It will, however, be a much more capable nuclear power than it has been in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes.
Okay, sorry for kicking everybody off the stage. I want to take this time to extend my thanks to Professor Chung and to the Asan Institute for inviting me here, and for all of you for taking time out of your busy weeks to come and listen. I've been tasked with looking at China's activities and weapons modernization in outer space, cyberspace, and the Arctic. So what I'll give you here is sort of a elevator speech for each one, so I have about 5 minutes to talk about each one. Let me first talk about outer space and space war. And there we go. So I'll let you read that as I'm talking. China has really gone, since the mid-1990s up to now, to in mid-1990s, China was at the point where it was launching very few satellites. Their satellites were not very capable. Their launch vehicles were exploding. And so it was really in dire straits. And in the space of 10, 15 years, they've managed to do almost a complete turnaround with their space program. They're conducting sometimes as many launches or more than the United States. They're launching many new types of satellites now. Some capable, not as capable as the United States, but still much more capable than what they were in the past. And their launchers now are at international reliability levels. So they have that competitiveness. And so what you hear now within the Chinese space program is they've gone from basically being a pariah where they couldn't do anything right, and now they're talking about that they want to move from becoming a major space power to becoming a strong space power, meaning they feel that they're a major space power now, but they want to become a strong space power like the United States or Russia. Okay? So what's been driving this? Most of what's been driving this is the military component of space. And almost every article or book that you read in Chinese literature on space is that somebody will say it's sort of a given that whoever controls space controls the Earth. And space is viewed as the new high ground. Okay? Why do they make this assessment? This assessment is based on looking at the U.S. performance in military conflict since the 1991 Gulf War. They see how the U.S. has used space, whether it's through remote imaging, surveillance, or whether it's through the use of our GPS, and they see us conducting precision strikes against military targets. They say that the U.S. depends on its depends on space for intelligence for anywhere from 70 to 80% of its intelligence. It uses satellites for 80% of its communications. And there's also this feeling that US-based, space-based ISR produces this exquisite intelligence, that if you're out during the day, sort of walking around, the US government knows what you're doing, right? So there's sort of this omnipotent idea for the U.S. military that China has. So they're looking at how space has made the U.S. military strong, and they say, we want some of that, okay? Because they say if you cannot control space, if you cannot derive those benefits of space, then you will lose in the next war. So what are they trying to do here? So what we've seen in the past 10, 15 years is we've seen extensive Chinese efforts to develop what we call the use of space and counter space. The use of space here means developing a C4ISR network that is integrated to provide information not only just regionally but also globally, an all-weather capability. And what the Chinese are striving for is sort of a network-centric force, where information can be shared across organizations, and that the lowliest private knows what the highest general knows, and what the highest general will know what the lowest private knows. Okay? So this sort of sensor fusion to provide a common battlefield picture to everybody within the military. Okay? That's their goal. On the counterspace side, they see that the US has gained lots of benefits from space. And if you take out those capabilities, you may be able to weaken the United States to such an extent that you can conduct follow-on strikes and hopefully achieve victory in the campaign. Now, China's been investing a lot in new satellite technology, and this is where they come into the use of space, the development of their C4ISR network. They've developed a number of new satellites. We have the Yaogan remote sensing system, we have Galfun, we have Haiyang that's looking at the ocean. And so what you see here are different resolutions, 1 meter resolution, 30 meter resolution, 2 meter resolution. So they have a number of different satellites with different capabilities. These satellites provide them with the ability to both image both during the day and at night. They have a synthetic aperture radar capability, and so they're able to see through clouds, through inclement weather, also at night. The Haiyang series of satellites gives them the ability to look at the ocean state. The Tianhui satellite gives them the ability to look at images in 3D to get even better intelligence. And so what they want to do with these satellites is by 2020 to develop a global, all-weather, 24-hour space-based intelligence system that they can image anywhere on the Earth during any part of the day. So we're talking not here just a regional capability, but a global capability. Then we also have the Beidou system, which is similar to our GPS system. Okay, again, they've looked at the way the US military has used GPS, both for navigation and for precision strike, and they say, yes, we need this. They are using GPS right now, but of course they don't want to be dependent on it, that we could somehow self-jam ourselves or we could turn it off. And so what they want to do by 2020 is to develop a global positioning system almost similar to what GPS is. Okay? The one caveat here is, though, is that by 2020, they're only predicting that they will have a 10-meter accuracy. And if you look at GPS, it's probably like something like several centimeters accuracy. So still much less capable than the US. But what Beidou has that GPS doesn't have is a 120-character short message service, something like Twitter, that you can communicate back and forth. So there's a nice sort of communication function that GPS does not have. The last satellite here is Tianlian, and that's called Skylink, and it's basically a data relay satellite. So because of the curvature of the Earth, it's difficult to send instructions up from ground station over to the other side of the Earth to a satellite that's on the other side of the Earth. So this gives them the ability to communicate with all satellites within their constellation. So here you see that they're developing an intelligence system, a global intelligence system, a global positioning system, and a global communication system that they can use to support their military both regionally and globally. But of course, you know, what they giveth, they also want to taketh away. Counterspace. China's been developing a wide range of capabilities, counterspace capabilities. Of course, the most significant one was the 2007 ASAT test, where they shot a missile at one of their defunct satellites and destroyed it. But since then, they've conducted other tests that can be considered de facto counter-space tests, anti-satellite tests, or they at least have anti-satellite capability. So in 2010 and 2013, they conducted missile defense tests. And with every missile defense system, there's a de facto anti-satellite system there. So it's widely considered that, yes, China learned its lesson with the 2007 ASAT test because it created a lot of debris which is still up there, but they've learned their lesson and they're conducting non-debris making tests with their missile defense tests. And last year, they also conducted what they called a high-altitude science mission, where they shot a missile high up into the atmosphere. The missile defense tests were largely considered to be tests against satellites in low Earth orbit, such as imaging satellites. The high-altitude test was considered to be a test of a capability to take out satellites in high Earth orbit, such as communication satellites or our GPS. China's also working on a wide range of directed energy weapons, including lasers, as well as co-orbital capabilities, meaning satellites that can change orbits and come and crash into another satellite, or they can use a robotic arm to grab a satellite and destroy it or disable it. Okay. Quickly now, moving on to cyber. Okay. We see sort of the same dynamics at work in cyber as we do in space. In the 90s, China really had no cyber capability to speak of. And now what you see here happening today is widespread Chinese cyber activity that is resulting in what the McAfee Corporation has called the largest transfer of wealth in the history of the world. Meaning that China's using cyber to conduct intelligence operations or cyber theft of proprietary information from companies worldwide. Now, what does China see in cyber operations? First of all, lots of advantages to cyber operations. They're low cost. You don't need to build a billion-dollar fighter to do this. They're easy to conduct covertly. Many people don't know that they're being actually attacked through computers. You can affect many computers in a short period of time. So a virus can spread very easily. Or if somebody's in the system, they can access all the computers within a system. Civilian and military personnel can conduct cyber operations, so you can use both your military and your civilian forces for this. And also Chinese say, and this is very interesting, that cyber can have a large destructive effect equivalent to nuclear weapons. So here they're talking about possibly the shutting down of like electrical power plants, that sort of thing, that could have a devastating effect on a country. Now there are several different elements of cyber operations. One is computer reconnaissance, where they go in and you try to look at what's inside a computer, find out the vulnerabilities. Also, this is also used to actually steal information from computers, and that's what China's doing most now. There's also computer network strikes, where they're going in where they're thinking about jamming or destroying an information system. And then there's network defense, where you're actually just trying to defend yourself against the attacks of others. And what we've seen in all three areas is that there have been increasing capabilities, and here I just want to talk about the sort of the cyber attack side. Okay, we've gone from in 2001, where there was a U.S.-China hacker war, where there were where Chinese hackers conducted some low-grade attacks against American websites, defacing the websites. In 2007, the U.S. Defense Department reported that the Chinese military was conducting computer network operations within their military exercises. But then it was really in 2009 where we see the large-scale cyber intrusions. There was Night Dragon, which was against 70 or so oil, energy, and petrochemical companies. In 2009, there was also GhostNet. Night Dragon was not so sophisticated. This one, they said, was really, really sophisticated against a range of political, economic, and media targets. And then in 2011, there's the RSA intrusions, which were probably their most effective cyber breach, where they're able to sort of break into the RSA with their encrypted networks and break into then Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics. Now, we've seen this sort of increase in cyber activity. But what does it sort of mean today? First of all, the massive cyber espionage that we've seen has proven to be sort of very effective. and shows that right now China's focusing more on the network reconnaissance. Right now they're into the networks trying to steal that technology, that IPR. But if they can get in to steal the IPR, they can also get in to take a look around to see what are the vulnerabilities, so they can exploit those vulnerabilities during wartime. They talk about ranges, targets at the strategic, operational, and tactical level. So anything from radar sites all the way up to strategic command and control centers. They're talking about attacks against civilian targets, transportation, financial, electrical nodes. Okay. But here's one thing I want to leave for the takeaway for the cyber side. Okay. Lots of talk about cyber, how this is the great new thing. Okay. Take it with a grain of salt, okay? Although cyber has been proven to be very effective for intelligence operations, its full potential is yet to be realized. We haven't had a real full-scale cyber war, okay? Russian cyber operations against Estonia and Georgia, effective to a degree, decisive, absolutely not, okay? So even the Stuxnet worm, okay, only managed to delay the Iranian nuclear program. It didn't actually sort of shut it down, okay? So this may be just one tool in China's coercive toolbox. It isn't a deciding factor. Okay, finally, quickly here. Also want to take a look at the Arctic, and this is sort of a different animal from space and cyberspace, okay? Arctic is fundamentally a political problem, not a military problem. The issue here is that as the planet warms, the Arctic is beginning to melt. That opens up economic opportunities, whether it's fishing or transportation routes, up in the Arctic Ocean. Okay? Right now, the main beneficiaries of that are the so-called Arctic 8 nations who have territorial claims in the Arctic Ocean. Okay? But as China sees those economic opportunities, they think that they need to have a stronger voice in how those opportunities are divvied out. Okay? They want a piece of the pie. Okay? So what we've seen in the past few years is that there are some Chinese military pundits who say that China needs to use military force in the Arctic. Okay? But what we've seen on the government side is that China is actually playing this very softly and not emphasizing the military, and is using more political means. And they're using these political means to sort of emphasize their interest in the Arctic for navigation, resource, and scientific issues. Navigation, it is stopped by going up above the northern sea route through the Arctic. You can cut 64 kilometers from your trip if you were to go through sort of the Straits of Malacca. You can also save billions of dollars a year by doing this. There are also a lot of resources in the Arctic. There's oil. They estimate that 30% of undiscovered oil is in the Arctic region. Also lots of minerals to be exploited. And there's also lots of scientific research done to figure out how China's economy will be impacted by global climate change. And so what we've seen is China has been opening up trade deals with the Arctic countries to exploit the oil and the mineral resources, and they've been cooperating with the Arctic countries to engage in scientific research. To sum this up, sort of the takeaways are China wants to be a strong Arctic power. They want to be able to sit in on the makings of the rights and norms of how the Arctic is used. They don't necessarily want to own it. Okay? They don't have the military capabilities or the inclination. Also, they have no legal case. Okay? They have no sovereignty. Unlike the East China Sea or the South China Sea, they have no territory there to claim. Okay? So China can be sort of described as being aggressive, but not really being, not being aggressive, but really sort of being more assertive and trying to claim some sort of rights to the area that states need to take into account China's interest. And also, just finally, put this out there: do the U.S. and China have similar interest in the Arctic? We are one of the Arctic countries. However, Canada and Russia and some of the other countries have much more access to the Arctic than we do. So we're in a similar position with China. So anyway, I will end there since I'm way over time, and I will cede the chair.
three presenters. I thank you very much for very comprehensive presentations. Now turn over to two designated discussants. First, Linda.
Thank you, Dr. Chung. Thank you to Dr. Chung and the Asan Institute for this invitation. It's always wonderful to be back in Seoul and at the Asan Institute. I'm going to start with comments on Andrew's paper. First, I'd like to say that he starts his paper with a very applaudable reminder about how little we know about certain aspects of China's military and the power that the PLA projects. I don't think this can ever be emphasized enough. In fact, Andrew has a great quote in his paper by Taylor Fravel and Alexander Liebman illuminating the debate which is going on inside China, both within the PLA but also within civilian military specialist circles on what at the end of the day is the chief source of threat to sea lines of communication, in other words, to the SLOCs. And this reminds us how hard it is for us outsiders to really say anything with certainty about China's military posture when they themselves are constantly debating this. So I very much applaud Andrew for that. Though I have to say to you that you do slightly forget this commendable acknowledgement later on in the paper by talking about, quote unquote, the remarkable improvement the PLA has made in training and operational capability. I'm always a little bit wary about this kind of a sweeping assessment because I come back to the question of how do we really know. So that's just a minor comment. In general, I think your paper, I'm presuming it's still a work in progress. There are sentences which don't end. It has lots of interesting insight, but my main comment is perhaps that it would benefit more from your own assessments. Especially towards the end of the paper, you have several paragraphs where you cite the assessments from official US agencies, and you write that the best that can presently be done with open sources is to review carefully the few judgments offered by the latest unclassified US government publications and to consider what are the most critical factors affecting the relevant questions. But that careful consideration by yourself is sort of missing. So I'd love to see that there. And I also think I'm presuming that you're still going to work on your conclusions, because you don't really in the conclusion come back and answer the question of how you evaluate China's conventional military capabilities. But a few more comments. One of the sort of provocative discussions in the paper, which I very much liked, was the question of whether the PLA in its near seas is less restrained by its weak connectiveness, its so-called weak jointness, than in operations further afield. And you write that in determining actual PLA Navy and PLA Air Force capabilities for the foreseeable future, analysts face this conundrum in which hardware has clearly reached a very advanced level, while software, in other words, personnel and training, remains more uneven and uncertain, and joint force integration is limited. And with respect to near seas operation, however, significant workarounds are available and mean that the PLA may not need education or jointness beyond what it already has. Now, I think this is a terribly important point, because if it's valid, it certainly has great implications for our assessments of China's behavior in the near future regionally. But I think it needs more spelling out, because in my mind, this weak jointness capability of both the Navy and the Air Force are hinders to effective operations in both the near seas and while projecting power further afield. In fact, by the way, what you said in your remarks just now was slightly more clear than it is in the paper, so I think that's a good starting point. One assertion that I certainly do disagree with and I would suggest that you rethink is what you write about China and the Arctic. As you know, this is a subject I've worked on quite a bit. Now, you mentioned the Arctic as a potential driver of Chinese power projection, and you list other drivers, for example, growing overseas interests. I agree with you. Growing resource demands. I agree with you. Protection of citizens. All of these I agree with. But then you go on to say that one driver could be China's, quote, major presence in two key great game regions, Africa and the Arctic. Now, just to begin with the terminology great game region, I think this is complete media hype. I would not call the Arctic a key great game region. There are many analysts who actually predict that the Arctic has the potential to be a region of security cooperation, not strife. People who much longer than I have studied the Arctic. I'm a newcomer to the subject. And secondly, when you write about the tremendous resources, these resources are nearly 89 to 90% of known resources are all within the EEZs of the 5 littoral Arctic states. And when we talk about cost assessments, it's going to be obviously extremely costly to extract these resources. At present, the technology to extract them doesn't even exist in the world. How commercially viable the sea lines are going to be for shipping is also questionable because the waters are so shallow, especially in the Russian, off the Russian coast, that they're not suited, for example, for bulk cargo, et cetera, et cetera. So I would be very cautious about saying that the Arctic is automatically going to be an arena of possible strife. As far as China is concerned, the Arctic is not a security policy or a foreign policy priority of China, not at the moment, but also it's not destined to be so within the time frame that Dr. Chong has given you. I think that it will remain a very low priority. And that brings me, of course, then to the second paper by Professor Kevin Palpeter. First, and I presume that this is not Kevin's doing, so maybe I have to direct.
The paper is by Chase.
Well, I'm going to go this way, if that's okay, because that's the way. The Arctic, I'm still stuck on the Arctic here. My first comment is perhaps not for Kevin, but it's to the editor. I have to direct my comments. I would not lump China's activities in outer space, cyberspace, and the Arctic in the same chapter. I would certainly suggest that the Arctic should be a distinct piece. Just as an anecdote, I was recently asked to write about the Arctic and NATO in the same chapter for a forthcoming handbook by Routledge on China's security. And I refused. I said, Liang Hui, sure, these are two distinct chapters. As I've already mentioned, I think misconceptions about the Arctic future generally speaking abound, and that pertains also to China's involvement in it. Now, I understand well your theme of the global commons and how the United States has dominated the global commons and how is China going to sit in that. But somehow I just don't see these three themes hanging together because, for example, if you have the Arctic, why don't you have the Antarctic? China puts 4/5 of its polar resources into the Antarctic. Only 1/5 of its polar resources today and in the foreseeable future will go to the Arctic, despite all the media hype about the Arctic. So that's one of my points. I think, Kevin, you do a very good job of explaining how China's responses to these three spheres of global commons differ. I very much like the way you describe China's activities in the Arctic, which are very much governed by scientific and commercial motives, and have very much less to do with the deployment of military forces. You also have a very insightful overview of how Chinese scholars approach the global commons. And, for example, for me, too, in my work on the Arctic in China, this is going to be very useful. So this comment that I just made is not really at all a critique of how you've handled the subject. It's just the question that I don't think they fit in the same chapter for the name of coherency. Overall, I think, Kevin, your paper is a very thorough, very useful examination of Chinese perceptions of both the use of outer space and cyberspace. And of course, it's very valuable that it's based on Chinese language sources. I think one, and probably my only substantive small comment and suggestion that I would have is that perhaps the paper warrants a discussion of the potential for space cooperation between China and the United States. I was looking at a report from 2013 from an inaugural US-China space security dialogue. I noted that the report mentioned that the tone of the discussion was very positive. The Chinese insisted that Beijing is indeed now ready and willing to engage in bilateral dialogue on space cooperation, and I think maybe it would be just useful to know, do you think that that's going to have any implications for China's own space developments? And then lastly, to Dr. Michael Chase's paper on nuclear capabilities of China. I have to immediately say I'm not a nuclear expert, so I'm going to look at this from a security policy analyst's point of view. I have to say it provides a very extensive overview of the development of both China's nuclear policy and strategy, as well as capabilities from the Mao era up until the end of the Hu Jintao era. I think for anyone reading it, a non-specialist included, the paper does a very good job of establishing that China's no first-use policy has not changed, despite the fact that it wasn't mentioned in the 2013 Defense White Paper. I remember the hype around that issue. I also think the paper very importantly deals with this question of the projected size of China's nuclear forces in the future, and the fact that a considerable disparity between the United States and China as far as nuclear stockpiles is likely to persist for the foreseeable future. And you explained that well in your remarks just now. Additionally, I think one of the valuable outcomes of the paper is that it comprehensively questions this assertion which one sees that China might already have thousands of nuclear weapons. And I think you put it, frame it very well, that China certainly has enough fissile material to expand its arsenal significantly, but not enough to build anywhere close to the size of a force that's been suggested by, among others, Philip Carber. So that's all positive. I have a few suggestions, and like I said, they're all from the viewpoint of an analyst who looks at security issues from the political point of view, from the holistic point of view. I think it would be valuable if you could include a discussion of how Japan's role in the nuclear calculus of the United States has impacted and will, in the foreseeable future, continue to impact China's nuclear policies. You do state on page 33 that there are key factors that are likely to influence Chinese decision-making about what exactly it requires in terms of nuclear force structure. And these include China's perceptions of its external environment, its relationships with major powers, and then you mentioned Japan. But that's the only time in the whole paper, which is quite a long paper, that you mention Japan. I think myself that Japan has a critical role to play alongside the United States in framing China's nuclear posture as we go forward. For example, a recent volume which was edited by Rory Medcalf of the Lowy Institute. In this volume, Chinese analysts Li Bin and He Yun write about extended deterrence, the centrality of extended deterrence to US security and alliance strategy. They write that the US and its allies are strengthening at present extended deterrence, especially in Northeast Asia, with the imagined enemy China in mind. And of course, they also write that this is not a happy prospect for China. And they note that extended deterrence was mentioned for the first time in Japan's 2010 defense program guidelines. and state that China cannot look upon this as a benign gesture. And there's quite interesting quotes in that chapter about Japan. So I think this very thorough examination of the development of China's nuclear capabilities and the strategy as we move forward would benefit by inserting this wealth of knowledge into the broader security picture. Also, you do mention, and you did in your remarks, the PLA Navy's role in nuclear deterrence, and it's going to increase as China takes this nuclear deterrent to sea. But I think this issue of ballistic missile submarines really warrants a bit more discussion in your paper, because it's going to have such profound implications for regional stability. And it's also going to have very serious implications for the internal dynamics of the PLA. You do mention that not only could the modernization of China's SSBN force eventually put the Navy on par with the 2nd Artillery as a core component of China's nuclear deterrent, but I think it's also going to have very far-reaching and deep implications for the way decisions are made within the PLA and the role that the Navy will play in decision-making. And then just lastly, a very minor comment is, I think the paper would benefit from an assessment of whether or not the various strategic dialogues between the United States and China are useful, are they effective, do they have any effect on China's nuclear thinking? Again, I noted that at a China-US dialogue on nuclear dynamics very recently, there was general agreement that the joint principles of mutual strategic reassurance should be developed. Is this going to affect the way China moves forward in its nuclear calculus? I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Ji.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, thank you for inviting me here, Zhu Hao. Asan China series of meetings is a big brand. I knew about it a long time ago. I always thought, oh, when I was invited to this conference, now here we are. Thank you very much, Asan Institute. Finally, my dream came true. Yeah, it is an honor to comment on 3 excellent papers. We belong to the same group of PRA studies organized by Andrew Yang, Phil Saunders, and others. So it's nice to have a reunion in Seoul rather than in Taipei. But anyway, it's a great pleasure. I'll start my comment by printing a big picture of PRA transformation. 2005, obviously, is a kind of trend analysis. If you want to have a trend analysis, you need to establish a reference point of time as present to show how the trend would evolve and how the result could be estimated and assessed. So the current point of time is really what the PRA is doing. Taiwan specialist, PRA specialist, and Arthur Ding wrote to me a few days ago, asked me, how do you describe the PRA is doing at the moment? I said just one word: prepare for war. War preparation is actually driver for PRA transformation, which is first of all capability based and enhanced. That's all the theme of all 3 papers analyzed so well, especially I think Michael's paper. If you have no capability, the so-called strategic aspiration is just empty word. So this is very, very important. But what exactly this PRA transformation is aiming at? I think one important aspect is to use Andrew's word, leadership refiguration at the very top. Linda just mentioned to create more jointness. That is the key word to understand PRA transformation in the next few years in the context of war preparation. But this transformation is not ordinary or normal transformation based on technological progress. It is war-focused, specific country targeted and a particular type of warfare designed. So it's no ordinary, no normal kind of transformation. It has clear enemies in mind, a clear type of warfare in the drawing board. So this is a very, very important, we call big picture assessment of PRA. I think the three papers currently lack this kind of big picture analysis. You are right, you concentrate on each service that you are required to do, but a big picture connection would help to have the better depth of service analysis, service strategies, and service capabilities assessment. Secondly, if you think about the trend of PRA development, it is inevitable you think about military budget. Andrew's paper mentioned that a little bit, not as your China quarterly paper, which is a more detailed analysis. Here, what is the big picture here? I think if you look at the current global structure of military spending, you have the United States way ahead of the next 27 countries, but in 2025, you have a very different picture of US ahead of China. China is well ahead of the next 20 nations. By then, the Chinese military budget is much bigger than the entire military budget of Asian countries combined, plus Russia, plus some of the European countries. So that, still within the so-called 1.5% of GDP. Even if we multiply it by 2, so by many Western estimates, it's still 2.5% of GDP, still way below about 4.7 or 4.8 GDP figure, GDP ratio of the United States. But that could do a lot of things for the Chinese in enhanced capabilities. I will come back to this a little bit more. So what is the ultimate goal for this transformation in military terms? Put it simply, to reduce US absolute superiority against China to one that is relative, especially in the West Pacific region. I remember 2004, I gave a talk at Australian National University. I said in 10 years' time or in PRA would be capable of choosing a battlefield in the West Pacific with a rough parity or even partial superiority with any other major powers. Obviously, I was too optimistic. 10 years wasn't enough. But by 2025, it would be certainly enough. So last week, U.S. Pacific commander said China posed serious threat to U.S. absolute dominance in air and in the sea in the West Pacific. I think he is very, very serious. By that time, even if it is not parity, China would be very capable of posing tremendous threat to the U.S. intervention or intervention effort that would make it more expensive than the U.S. will be hesitant to intervene in regional so-called territorial disputes. So that is one of my argument against Andrew's your last section, that will U.S. fight against another nuclear power over Sharpshore or even Senkaku Island? So that is a major question. So what we learned from the Ukraine is that you don't, in the major power relationship, especially between China and the United States, you have to leave a level of space for compromise, for reconciliation. You don't want to be hijacked by smaller states, and the smaller states really want to hijack you and use you in confronting China so as to gain with another major power. So this is a kind of lesson we have to learn from the Crimea incident. Now I come to specific paper. I'm sorry, I may run out of time. First,
you have time.
Okay. Actually, I made my comment according to the time sequence I received the paper. So actually, the first paper arrived, that's Michael's paper. First of all, we all agree that China has this non-forced use policy. This we call generic state policy, but it's very different from the PRA's comeback doctrine. The Chinese nuclear doctrine catering for real, let's say, exchange of nuclear weapons. That had nothing to do with non-forced use policy. Especially, they started to learn Russians' deliberate announcement of using nuclear weapons against any other country. That here, I think to understand the Chinese nuclear strategy in combat term is not really non-forced use. It's actually we call the minimum but reliable MAD capability. That is very clear that without MAD capability, there is no deterrence. I argued this in one of the PRA conferences 2-3 years ago. Interestingly, in the conference, the PRA people try to criticize me, but in private, they all express this view that your view is very, very important. Actually, that is the view of Zhu Chenghu's remark quite a number of years ago. So what is this minimum but reliable MAD capability? So it's all, I think Michael's paper, we call a numbers game. A numbers game means that China has 4094 submarines. Another one is on C-12, and the final one will be completed probably in the next 2 years. Actually, 094 has been concluded. Then they have already moved to 096. But if you count the numbers, that is 5 multiplied by 12, and each missile has 3 warheads, that is 180. Now, if you have 2 or 3 brigades for DF-31 and DF-41, and especially 41, according to open sources by Senior Colonel Shao Yonglin from the 2nd Artillery Force, has 10 warheads, multiple re-entry vehicle. If you have 2 or 3 brigades, that will substantially increase the number of warheads. In relevance to your paper that is about the nuclear material, to fill the gap to building these kind of warheads, now you have to phase out Dongfeng DF5, and those material cannot be used. Then we know China ceased the plutonium production long time ago. So the only option is enriched uranium production. So on this particular basis, 280 to 350 warheads, that is the minimum. That is reliable. Now, if you think about the reality, I think one senior Chinese military leader, when he visited the United States, he was asked this question. Now, U.S. has dozens of warheads, thousands of warheads to hit China. What do you have against U.S.? Now, he answered in a very typical way of Chinese. You destroy 100 Chinese cities. Okay, that is your victory. We destroy 10 American cities. That is our victory. So that's basically the kind of thing that cannot be explained by, simplistically by so-called non-forced use policy and so on and so forth. Now, specifically your paper, I think your history part is too long, too detailed. So many long citations, you can just simply cut them and concentrate more on combat use of nuclear weapons. For example, in 1984, China started to design and project we call the tactical use of nuclear weapons in battlefield. All these kind of things. That's I think more important than assessment of history. Now, Kevin's paper. I understand Asan Institute paid us here to make comment. Excellent paper on the one hand, but they asked us to make as critical comments as possible. So I try to be a little bit critical on this common domain. That's a generic concept from our point of view, defense and the military point of view. When you talk about the space war or cyber warfare, it's not a common domain at all. From Chinese point of view, it's bilateral, U.S. and China. And in terms of depth of fight, it's way away from the so-called common domain thing. I know it's very important for you because without this analytical framework, it's hard for Arctic section to be put in. But I think your two parts, the cyber and space, are good enough. I think the Arctic, I think it's very good, but doesn't provide too much new information for us. Probably it could be new for the general readership. I think Jay Hall would make decision later on.
I'll explain myself later.
Okay, but on the Star Wars, let me talk first. It is also a mad issue. A mad issue in the sense that we call it tactical mad. Technical mad means that you destroy. I think China is capable of destroy all lower or even higher Earth orbit satellite, imagery satellite very easily. DF-3 is cost about $150 million. You destroy any GPS system, it's $400 million. So the mad effect would be you create tremendous amount of debris in the space that nobody could use it anymore. So that is mad, mutually assured destruction. But that was the idea I wrote 2 years ago, attending Korea Air Force Chief Conference here. One of the audience asked me, what do you mean by what would be the threshold for China to think about it? I answered from my reading of Chinese sources. That is when the Chinese homeland targets are hit. That is suggested by air-sea battle concept. The Chinese studied very seriously about the effect of Kosovo War and even Iraqi War before. I think in their 3-day conference, Jiang Zemin attended 2.5. That was very unprecedented. So they came to this conclusion that the accumulated effect of conventional strike could create effect of a tactical nuclear strike. So in your presentation, you made it very clear. It's a one-way battlefield transparency. Now, if you do it, the Chinese will launch its own Star War. The dirty truth is that it's a lot easier and cheap to attack space objects rather than the other way around. It's very difficult for you to defend. But the effect was similar to the nuclear thing. Then you
have about 2 minutes.
Okay, sure. In terms of capabilities, I think China has launched more space objects than the United States in the last 2 years. By 2025, China is the only country that operates a space station. So let's give you a picture how China is catching up. Finally, Andrew's paper is also a very good paper, but my question is that is not your fault. You're asked to do assessment of Chinese capabilities of Air Force and the Navy. Now, most of the things are symmetric platforms, but how it used in a symmetrical situation. So there is a gap. I think you have to fill up this gap, the so-called AD and 2A. So it's ironic that the Chinese have developed so much energy, developed so many symmetric weapon systems, including very stupid construction of Liaoning carrier. So this is a gap they cannot, fill up, and so I leave it to you to fill it up. In 2013, in a particular year, China had 23 capital ships in the water, 18 formerly in service. That was a capability of entire Chinese Navy between 1949 to 1999, 30 years. So in Chinese, we call it Jingpen, that's a birth of the well. So this trend will continue to go. Let's come to this very critical question. We in China study, PRE business, ask ourselves continuously, can we still use this concept of pockets of excellence to describe Chinese military modernization? Or China has entered a period of comprehensive transformation in terms of R&D, weapons addition, and so on and so forth. From 2004 onwards, argue that China has moved into the second phase. Now that has been, convincingly proved by what happened last year.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Linda and Yoji, for very good comments. Before I ask the presenters to respond to the discussants, let me, like the previous session, let me throw in some of my own comments as the editor. I think my reading of the three papers suggests that China is a rational actor. A lot of people seem to portray China as a country which is willing to do anything to enhance its military capabilities. Apparently it's not. For instance, China is more aggressive on conventional rather than on nuclear capabilities development. And according to Kevin, China has been more aggressive on the cyber and outer space rather than Arctic. So there seem to be some variations according to the domains that are involved. My defense to Linda's criticism of this, putting these three things together in one chapter, Kevin is not guilty. If there is someone who is guilty, it's me. But when I first assigned this to Kevin, I gave him a tentative title, which is Extreme Capabilities. I don't know whether that will capture these three issues, but you can just take into account what they said in footnotes when you do the revision. Now, my comments for Andrew. You said in your paper that China made the transition from MiG-19 to Sukhoi-27 in just 15 years, which was surprising to many people, according to what you wrote. That means China has potentials for leapfrogging in military technologies, right? Then by 2025, where China will be in terms of counter-intervention capabilities vis-a-vis the United States. If you can, elaborate on this, I'll be thankful. Second one, living in Korea, I tend to see a lot of things from a Korean perspective. Of course, China sending anti-piracy forces to, Gulf of Aden or send forces to Middle East. That is important from America's perspective, but from Korean perspective, it doesn't really matter that much. So what we focus on is what kind of capability China really has vis-a-vis the Northeast Asia or East Asia in general. And as we talked yesterday, Rear Admiral Mike McDavid once said, China is already a regional peer competitor vis-a-vis the United States. Do you agree with that assessment as of today? My one comment for Mike, your characterization of China's nuclear capabilities development is China has been consistent, rather modest, slow, gradual, mostly reactive. They need to adapt and update. This seems to suggest, at least to me, that China's policy on nuclear capabilities probably more up to what the United States does in the future. Is that a fair assessment that can be drawn from your paper? And then lastly for Kevin, thank you very much for taming 3 different species of animal and leading them into the cage just in 15 minutes. But in these 3 sectors, particularly in the first 2 sectors, that cyber and outer space, this is not the usual conventional military domains. So therefore, is it possible that China may accomplish a faster pace of leapfrogging in technology? Okay, now in reverse order, starting from Kevin.
Okay, thank you. I'll start off with Linda's comment on space cooperation. I would say that it's the U.S. really that has not been willing to cooperate with China in space, and that China is willing to cooperate with anybody on just about anything in space if given the opportunity. They pretty much said, you know, we're open to anything. The issue really is with the United States, and because of the potential for a military conflict between China and the U.S., the Defense Department is really unwilling to engage in any substantial cooperation with China in space. Our export control laws are still, while they have been loosened, they have not been loosened against China or space technology. So even if a European satellite has US-made components in it, it cannot be sold to China. And I wouldn't see any of that changing in the near future, within 2025. Even NASA has been prohibited legally from cooperating with China in space. Frank Wolf, congressman from Virginia, had put into the National Defense Authorization Act back in 2010 that forbid NASA from cooperating. So we're really seeing no movement on that front. Now, Frank Wolf is retiring this year, so he will be replaced. So is it possible that that language would be removed? Absolutely. And NASA seems keen on at least having some sort of conversation with the Chinese about some sort of cooperation. Whether that will lead to anywhere, I'm not sure. But certainly you could see areas that don't have to involve technology transfer or Chinese astronauts on the International Space Station. So for example, cooperative space research where the US sends up a satellite to do one part of a study and the Chinese send up another satellite to do another part of the study, and then the two could combine the studies. And that way we're sharing more of the scientific results rather than the technology. So maybe there's some possibility there, but generally I'm pretty pessimistic about any sort of cooperation in space. Moving on to Yoji's comments about a bigger picture. Yeah, I take that point. One thing I would add, and it kind of fits with your mad argument that you were about space warfare, is you talked about developing a warfighting capability. I would also add that I think there's a definite deterrent capability that China is trying to develop conventionally. What we overlook in the United States is the impact of the 1999 bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. And what some of our research at UC San Diego has uncovered is that that was a pivotal moment with Chinese thinking about the United States, and that when that happened, there were high-level meetings conducted immediately, and Jiang Zemin ordered the PLA to develop weapons that can shoot far, look far, and shoot accurately. And he ordered the PLA to develop weapons that whatever the enemy is afraid of, that's what we should develop. So here's where we get the whole Shashoujian, Assassin's Mace, asymmetric warfare capability. And so do we know what type of weapons were officially ordered at that time? No, but you can think about ASAT weapons, cyber weapons, anti-ship ballistic missiles. And so it really was sort of, and Jiang Zemin reportedly stated, if they're brazen enough to attack our embassy, what's to stop them from striking Zhongnanhai? And so there's this real sort of, that China needs to develop strategic capabilities to be able to deter the US from doing something like that in the future. Additionally, I would say that some of the readings that I've been looking at where the PLA talks about of this concept of the PLA as a force for peace in the world. And if you look at like the new historic mission, that means like UN peacekeeping, counter-piracy operations, but yet you also see a lot of PLA, I wouldn't say a lot, but some PLA writers who are saying that the way that the PLA becomes a force for peace in the world is that it views the U.S. military or the U.S. as a force for instability in the world. And so so in order to enforce peace upon the world, you need to stop the U.S. from doing what it does. And that requires a strong U.S. PLA presence. And so, so there's a definite deterrence aspect to all of this. My concern with the MAD issue in space is that there are so many Chinese writings which state that it is that you need to command space in order to achieve victory on the Earth. That could and that there is absolutely an offense dominant characteristics of space warfare that will sort of feed the Chinese into striking space, and they will discount the MAD part.
Your time is almost up.
Okay, and so I've spent so much time talking, I forgot your question about will they be able to develop leapfrog technologies? Was that your question?
Well, we can move on to the next.
Okay,
that's fine. So, Mike.
Okay, sure. I don't think I have time to address each of the comments in detail, but I'll try to select a few highlights. One is the question about how Chinese nuclear force modernization is linked to their kind of strategic threat perceptions. I think this also ties into the comments about providing some broader strategic context for the discussion. So I mean, I think it's primarily about the United States, but not exclusively. And so Japan is important in the context of U.S. extended deterrence, of course, and also potentially from the perspective of some Chinese scholars who are worried that Japan, in the longer run, especially if they lose confidence in the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence, might pursue its own nuclear capability. So Japan could be relevant in that sense as well. I can certainly try to address that. But of course, I think a lot of this really is about choices that the Chinese will make in response to their concerns about what the United States is doing, because the United States really does loom large as the adversary who they're the most concerned about at a strategic level, as well as in terms of the specific kinds of campaigns that they talk about in their operational literature. Of course, many of those are focused on scenarios in the near seas. However, they also tend to address what would happen if the United States military intervened in one of those regional conflicts. And so thinking about how nuclear force modernization is linked to those conventional campaigns that they write about, I think is important as well, because it's, in my view, meant to deter escalation and to prevent the United States from escalating to the nuclear level or threatening to escalate to the nuclear level, but also to constrain the conventional options that are available to the United States because of concerns about escalation risks. And so there is a fairly detailed body of Chinese literature about nuclear deterrence, about conducting nuclear strikes, about what they refer to as a nuclear counterattack campaign. So there is a tremendous amount of material out there that I could draw on if I'm to address some of those issues. So just a couple of other very quick comments. The role that other countries play in China's nuclear calculus, I mean, again, I think Japan is sort of at least partially subsumed underneath the United States because of the extended deterrence issue. But India as a factor in China's thinking about nuclear issues is, I think, one that could be of growing importance as India's own capabilities improve. For many years, I think Chinese analysts have tended to discount India, or at least haven't taken India as seriously as Indian analysts take China. But then again, as India becomes a more powerful actor in its own right and develops nuclear capabilities that are more impressive in many respects, that may change the way that Chinese analysts think about India, and so you might need to start to include India in these kinds of discussions as well as the United States and Japan. Just one other quick point on future nuclear forces and tactical nuclear weapons and the like. I mean, if the PLA Air Force at some point in the future has a nuclear capable bomber, my guess is it would have air-launched cruise missiles, which you could view as potentially as tactical nuclear weapons. I mean, one of the challenges here is that the United States and China have very different sets of concepts and different force structures. I mean, I tend not to view those as tactical nuclear weapons, even if they would develop those. When I think about tactical nuclear weapons, I think about capabilities that the United States and the Soviet Union deployed during the Cold War, like atomic demolition munitions, other things of that nature. I don't believe that China has any particular interest in those. But again, it partially depends on how you define these things. And there are some challenges there in that the United States and the Soviet Union tend to use, of course, a lot of the same, and Russia now, a lot of the same language because of the arms control structure. So we talk about operationally deployed strategic nuclear weapons. That means something specific in the context of the New START Treaty. That doesn't really mean anything to China. China doesn't use the same criteria there. So my final point is on the utility of the strategic dialogues. I think of course, it all depends on how you measure success. If you really wanted to influence Chinese decision making, that's a much higher bar. If you wanted to help do something more modest, like help define a kind of common set of concepts and terminology, or at least help better understand the differences that exist between the two sides in terms of how they think about certain things, there I think it's actually has been quite useful and potentially could be very useful in the future, even if it's reaching a kind of higher level of policy utility where you have a more direct impact on their decisions might be again kind of a high bar. I think if you have lower expectations, they're more likely to be satisfied. And even at that kind of level of lower expectations, I think there are some very useful and productive things to be gained.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. This my paper definitely remains a work in progress, so I look forward to continuing to improve it and bring in these suggestions. The concept of China being a regional peer competitor of the U.S. militarily is intriguing, very much needs to be considered. I don't think it should be accepted uncritically. One of the critical questions is to look at is technological leapfrogging. So far, we've only seen evidence, including the example I gave of the PLA Air Force, of China, in effect, leapfrogging itself. It's a very different thing to talk about China leapfrogging the capabilities of other countries. We could eventually see that in areas perhaps such as hypersonics, nanotechnology, where the U.S. does not have a long-established lead, but we are far from actually seeing that in practice. This brings up the complex area of net assessment. I will definitely do more of that in the paper. That's been a limitation up to this point. However, I do want to stress that this often involves complex multivariate equations that are addressed too simplistically and with too much certitude using open sources. So I think a lot of caution is needed in that regard. I will do my best under those circumstances. In terms of potential drivers, I should have been clearer on page 11 of my paper. This was an effort to think of every possible thing that could make China move as far in the direction of power projection as possible by 2025, 2030. What I was really trying to show is it's my baseline assumption that China will not move greatly in that direction. Even with the most heroic assumptions possible, it's hard to see tremendous Chinese movement and shift in that direction, and I need to reframe that more clearly. Two final points. Of course, these are all my personal views, but I think given the issues of the time, very clearly near seas issues are not equivalent to the situation in Crimea. The situation in Crimea, in my view, is a terrible tragedy as well as a travesty. But to be clear, for the purposes of near seas issues, those near seas issues are very different. They involve clear U.S. vital interests, continued U.S. commitment that in a worst case scenario, if necessary, will be backed, in my view, with complete military force, whatever is necessary under the circumstances. This is clearly codified in alliances, established alliances and treaties. So two completely different things should not be conflated or misunderstood. Finally, the issue of amid growing Chinese capabilities, I think some of the useful comments here essentially were saying, well, if Chinese capabilities continue to increase so much, how can the U.S. hope to support its alliances, maintain its commitments, prevent a significant change in the status quo? I think the key is the phrase status quo regarding disputed island and maritime issues. The U.S. wants to preserve that, believing that the current situation is the least worst situation and that force or the threat of force should not be used to change that. This gives the U.S. very different objectives and force requirements, operational requirements, vis-a-vis any other country that would try to change that, such as potentially China. And I could go into more detail, but here, as a sort of bottom line strategy, a deterrence by denial strategy is good enough, I believe, to continue to achieve that, maintain that commitment, and preserve the peace. So thank you for all these comments. I look forward to incorporating and addressing them.
Thank you. While the time is up for the session, but since we didn't have any time for the floor discussion in the first session, so I would like to solicit one or two questions if you have any. You can just raise your hand. The person in the back. Please identify yourself first and then state your question very briefly. No long comments, please.
안녕하세요. 중앙일보 유지혜 기자라고 합니다.
잠깐만. 여기 아무도 끼고 있지 않아. 영어로 하는 줄 알았지 나는. You have...
예, 에릭슨 교수님께 두 가지 질문 드리겠습니다.
잠깐만 기다리세요. 잠깐. The question for you.
예, 두 가지 질문 드리겠습니다.
어디서 왔는지 좀 먼저 얘기하시고.
중앙일보 유지혜 기자입니다. 예, 첫 번째 질문은 한국의 MD 체계 편입에 대한 것인데요. 미국은 계속해서 한국이 MD 시스템에 편입되기를 바라고 있지만 중국은 굉장히 직접적으로 강한 우려를 표하고 있습니다. 오바마 대통령이 이달 말에 방한할 때도 다시 의제가 될 것으로 보이는데요. 이럴 경우에 중국이 다시 북한과의 군사협력을 강화하는 것이 아니냐는 우려까지 나오고 있는데 이에 대한 의견 부탁드리고요. 두 번째는 영내 안보 상황과 직결되는 한반도 긴장 상황에 대한 문제입니다. 최근에 북한의 것으로 추정되는 무인 항공기가 한국에서 발견이 됐는데요. 특히 무인 항공기는 김정일의 동선을 숨기는 계기가 될 정도로 북한에게 큰 공포였는데 이번엔 오히려 청와대 상공까지 침투를 시켰습니다. 다소 충격적으로 받아들여지는데 미국의 북한의 무인 항공기 기술에 대한 평가는 어느 정도인지 이에 대한 대응은 어떻게 생각을 하시는지 의견 부탁드립니다.
You can just answer the first question. Let me get another question. If anyone has a question, okay, go ahead.
Thank you for these very interesting questions. I'm not privy to a lot of these specific details. I can offer my own specific opinions with regard to your first question and the related question. I think that as a sovereign country, definitely the Republic of Korea is free and should remain free to provide for its defense requirements as it sees fit, particularly with the unfortunate and continued military threat from North Korea. I seriously doubt that China would significantly enhance its military cooperation with North Korea. I think that would be extremely irresponsible if that were the case, and I doubt it will happen. This is clearly an unstable, irresponsible North Korean regime that it does not have a positive future or history, and I hope we can all look forward to a peaceful peninsula in the future, that the Korean people get to decide the course of themselves without other people dictating it. That's my personal view. Thank you.
Thank you. With that note, the session 2 is adjourned, and we're facing session 3, which will last 3 hours without a mid-time break. So please go out and refresh yourself and come back. Session 3 will start at 3:05. Okay.
If I make a reservation with my comments